And then you got this guy, Robert Mondavi, who comes along in the 60s and he's like, I've got an idea. I'm gonna open up a winery. And not only a winery, like a huge, ambitious winery. Like I wanna take down the French. I wanna make the best wine in the world here in California at a time. It's like imagine the economy goes down in like 2008 and you're like, I wanna open up a car manufacturer in Detroit. That's what Robert Mondavi did with wine. The guy has got brass balls, man.
If anybody thinks about American wine, the first thing they think about is Napa Valley, without a doubt.
I think if Robert Mondavi didn't exist, California wine wouldn't exist.
At that time, in 1960s, the valley was still kind of all back, I think there were 17,000 acres of grapes. Today there are 40,000. Much of the valley was for sale. It was still sort of recuperating from phylloxera, from depression, from the war and all that. And many people didn't believe it. But he went forward, built a new winery, the first new winery since Prohibition.
So this particular bottle is the first vintage created by the Robert Mondavi Winery, which opened in 1966.
At one point, he was small, he was boutique, he was family-owned, he was cool. And I still think he is, because that part is like history, and that, so even if you buy big wines, like what's the story? Why do you buy them? Why did they become successful? There was some guts there.
This was the model that Mondavi said, even with this first vintage, is what's still in use today.
You could almost feel like anxiety probably in the bottle, but also like hope. I think it's amazing.
Well, this is actually an incredible bottle. It's very, very, very aromatic, very perfumed. The fruits are red and high-toned, like red apple skin, or like a dried cherry. And then there's this beautiful sort of cigar ash, but it's very, very vibrant and very, very alive. For me, I think ageability is a necessary tenet to greatness in wine, and this is undeniably one of the great wines.
In your first wine, you produce a wine of that quality, I mean, there's more than luck in that one.
I wanted to produce wine to compete with the finest wines of the world.
Here's the Europeans. Think about it from their perspective. You've been doing it this way from the beginning, since the time the Romans planned the damn place, right? And all of a sudden, along comes Robert Mondavi.
I went throughout the world to find out what my competition was.
That's something which, I think we've all learned from Robert Mondavi. He used to always go around the world and taste other wines and always have a bottle of Mondavi with him. And then he used to always compare his wines to other great wines.
Just an incredible voice for Napa Valley. I think he understood that if you made a name for Napa Valley and how great this place is in the world, everyone rises. So it wasn't about any particular winery. He wanted to actually speak how beautiful this place was.
In this fine wine business, it's not going to take 5 years, not 10, it's going to take a lifetime. You have to be willing to take a gamble. You have to put your whole heart and soul into what you are doing. But that's all. It's very simple.
If I'm known for anything as a judge in Paris, well, the most famous wine event in the last 50 years.
It was a time when New World wines were beginning to emerge on the world wine market. But there were a lot of people who thought that they would never match the old world wines that had been around for so long, on which the wine market was based at that time.
Stephen Spurrier brought the best California wines of the day and put them against the best French wines of the day.
At that stage, the wine world knew Bordeaux chiefly.
So we invited the 9 best palates in France over a wide spectrum.
90% of all the judges never tasted a California wine before, so they had no perception of what California was capable of.
So he said, okay, I've got to put in the French wines side by side with these Californians, or they won't take it seriously.
Nowadays, blind tasting, everyone just assumes it happens all the time. It was totally new, really, back then.
He was hoping that one of the wines would come in top 5 in either category and saying, hey, let's pay attention to California wine.
Well, the rest is history.
California wines ended up topping the Chardonnay category and Cabernet Sauvignon category, which I think blew everyone's mind.
We went up against the very, very best stuff, and we won.
And then all hell broke loose.
Shit happens.
He never knew they were going to win. No one did.
I don't think either of us realized the implications at the time.
Congress has it listed in as actual historical event. You can see the bottles in the Smithsonian.
And that changed the world. We weren't just a joke anymore. We weren't just the upstart Americans. We were a threat.
Several French suppliers contacted us and said they would never speak to us again. I mean, people were horrible to the judges, and they were very loyal to Stephen, the judges.
The actual event itself, it didn't seem important at the time, but the fallout of the Judgment of Paris is really the thing.
The fact that it was a blind tasting, they weren't competing with the history and the heritage and all the glory of Bordeaux and Burgundy. They were competing on their merits.
It got the East Coast to say, hey, maybe there are some good wines in California. Let's start selling their wines.
We owe our existence, if you will, to the Judgment of Paris, 1976.
That's crazy. Like now we think of Napa Valley, it's like one of the best wine producing regions in the world.
The biggest thing that happened was the prices went up. I was bummed. I was buying that stuff for nothing, man.
It caused an explosion on the business front. Absolutely everybody made more money.
With Bordeaux, which were the Cabernet-based wines in France, there was already a classification system of the best wines in the world, and so they chose the first gross of Bordeaux. One of the really interesting aspects was they didn't choose the most famous California wineries at the time.
I could have easily put in Mondavi, I knew him. But his wasn't the wine I was after.
They chose artisanal, family-run, very high-quality producers.
If you had to make a short list of the top 10 wineries in Napa Valley, then Opus One would definitely be on that list. But if you had to name just one winery that produced outstanding wines, had stunning architecture, and the most fascinating story behind it, then, in my opinion, Opus One is top of the list. After all, it was the creation of two men who were arguably the greatest vintners of the 20th century.
Barão Philippe is clearly one of the great wine masters of the 20th century, and his storied history at Château Mouton Rothschild deserves long telling. And this very visionary winemaker recognized that something interesting was coming out of California with its wines. So he began asking people around within the trade, importers, distributors, retailers, who should he speak to learn about what's happening with California? Who's leading this charge? And they all told him the same thing, that he had to meet this man, Robert Mondavi.
The Baron invited Robert Mondavi to come to Bordeaux to meet him. He never said why. The first evening they spent enjoying old vintages of Mouton and getting to know each other with not a word of business.
The next morning, Robert was invited into the bedroom of Barão Philippe de Rothschild. The Baron at that point was 76 years old, and he'd taken to doing work from his bed in his bedroom. So the two gentlemen spent what we say is about an hour and a half together, and the idea was to create one single red wine of the very highest quality possible. And the challenge with this red wine was that it should reflect the personality and character of Château Mouton Rothschild, and also the personality and character of Robert Mondavi Winery. And when those characters are blended together, it should create its own unique, exceptional expression and style. So the idea was consummated in '78. First wine was 1979.
The first vintages were made at Robert Mondavi whilst the stunning new winery was being built. In the early stages, both men had to make dozens of critical decisions that would shape the future of the wine and the brand.
The two families decided that the name should be in Latin. It was an interesting idea, so that both languages would have an equal approach to this word, sort of a neutral approach. So Latin makes sense. And they struggled with a lot of different names. They had the concept of twins, Gemini, Janus, the two-faced creature. And as the story goes, it was the Baron who called Robert and said, I have the name. The name is Opus. It's a musical masterpiece work. And apparently Robert responded and said, yes, that's a good idea, but it's not quite complete. So I hung up. A week and a half later, the Baron called back and said, okay, now I've got it. It's Opus One, underscoring the real focus I had on this one wine. And when the Baron said Opus One, Robert said, that's right. That's got the cadence, it's got the meaning, and they accepted that name.
If choosing the name for the winery wasn't hard enough, then deciding on the final blend, the label design, and the architecture of the new winery were all challenges that the project encountered.
It was never easy. I mean, it was, if you think of this as a marriage between two families, which is a fair way to think about it, this was not a 30-year honeymoon. These were two
very strong-minded,
opinionated, frequently stubborn, but both searching for that same point, but having different ways of getting to it.
When the first vintage was released in 1981, expectations from the media and buyers were running high. Despite the secrecy surrounding the project, everyone knew about it, and the pressure on both men to show an outstanding wine was immense.
The very first Napa Valley vintners auction Napa Valley, was in 1981, and a case of Opus One was released named as Napa Médoc, and at that point sold for $24,000, which was the highest price at that point ever paid for wine. Both Barão Philippe de Rothschild and Robert Mondavi were accustomed to handling anticipations, expectations, and pressure. They lived for it.
Indeed, Opus One invented the category of ultra-premium fine wine in America. At release, the wine was priced at $50 a bottle, which was far above any other winery at the time, and it sold out in a heartbeat. Opus One became a huge success for several reasons. They had the finest winemakers in the world, a showpiece winery, and a distribution network second to none. But perhaps above all, the winery was successful because of the total focus on making one single wine.
Well, if you think about a winery that has a limited amount of resources, personnel, energy, money, time, if you take that limited amount, make a round numbers 100, and you're going to make 10 wines, you have to divide that energy amongst 10 wines. If you take that same amount of energy, resources, money, and time, and you put it all towards one, you get that much more energy and focus towards that one wine. And we believe that the way that we make our wines reflect that attention of detail and energy.
The attention to detail at Opus One extends from the vineyards all the way to the final sale of the wine. It is exported globally and is in fact the only American wine to be sold through the Bordeaux Négociants, the most powerful network of fine wine traders in the world. Opus One, in many ways, is the flag bearer of great Napa wines.
Oh, I think it's undeniably been one of the landmark wines, and was one of the first of its kind in very many ways. And as such, particularly with the partnership with a wine such as Château Mouton Rothschild, it brought to Napa Valley recognition, a global recognition of credibility and quality, and has been through the last 30 years in many ways one of the leaders in wine innovations and vineyard innovations, and has become an iconic wine of California.
When you drive by the winery, the imposing gates give the impression of exclusivity, where access is only granted to a select few. But surprisingly, this is not the case.
People come up to me all the time in the valley saying, "Can you get me into Opus?" I go, "Sure, just call and come on in."
Thought maybe we should begin with geography and let our viewers know exactly where Opus is and where are the vineyards that contribute to this great wine.
We're located in Oakville, which is right between the heart and soul of Napa Valley. And we have 4 estate vineyards. 2 are located right at the winery to the north and south. They surround the winery. And then one is across the highway. It's 50 acres. It's Tokelon North. And the other is the southeastern corner of Tokelon, which we call Tokelon South, another 50 acres. So altogether we have 170 acres, always about 10% out of production as we continue to redevelop our vineyards. As you heard about in the vineyard, we started harvest on the 19th of September and ended on the 25th of October. And it was a big harvest because of the long, cool growing season and the fact that we had excellent set. And so the fruit came in very steadily, but it didn't stop. Once it started, it was like a train, one delivery after another. But it was amazing how the cellar crew was like a water ballet team, the way they handled it. And just an amazing vintage. This particular vintage, 2018, it's a little bit different in composition, 84% Cabernet Sauvignon, 6% Petit Verdot, 5% Merlot, 4% Cabernet Franc, and coming in to pull it all together, 1% Malbec. And the aromas of this wine, we've got cherry, cassis, white tea, violets. The first thing I smelled when I checked the wine was this beautiful freshness, like the freshness when you smell the stems of red roses. The flavors, it's unusual because it's not always like this, but the flavors are a true reflection of the aromas. And the tannins are so smooth and round with a little bit of a creaminess, and the texture is very silky, but there's a little bit of satin, a little bit of an edge there. The layers are just so compact and concentrated, yet this wine has such great restraint. And the finish is very long, and the fruit comes back at the finish. Cheers.
How can you choose? They're all lovely. They're like our children, right? And so you love all of your children. And yet in a way you come to have certain relationships. It's hard for me personally, I think those of us at the winery here today, not to have a special relationship with the vintages that we've been involved with. The recent vintages, 2008 was one of an exceptional concentration and complexity that we love. The recent vintages, 2012, 2013, are some of the best we may have ever made, and those are very exciting. But usually that kind of answer doesn't satisfy people. They want one single year, and if I'm put in a corner and have to choose one vintage today, it's probably the 1987.